So welcome everybody to beautiful Florence. We are very happy to have you here for our conference on intergenerational persistence, inequality. And this is a topic where economists and sociologists meet. And that's for me the key topic where the two fields have things to say and work together. And that's why I like that we have this joint conference together with Herman and also with Frank from Georgetown, and very pleased that all of you came together to discuss this, what is for me one of the key trends in society, or the key topics, intergenerational persistence or persistence and inequality. And today we are going to, since the two cultures in sociology and economics, the two fields and two cultures are meeting, we also have two different cultures of styles of discussion. Okay, in presentations. So to set the rules, economists are used to interrupt the speakers and ask questions during the talk. We are going to do that, we are going to allow that, but please leave the introduction to the speaker. So that's our rule. Introduction is for the speaker, and then you are welcome to ask questions as we do in economics. Okay? We have 45 minutes in total. That means we will have sufficient time also at the end of the presentations to ask questions, but as I said, whoever wants to interrupt can interrupt, just not during the introduction. Okay? So we have about 35 minutes then for the presentation and 10 minutes of discussion. Okay? Good, and then I don't want to say anything more at this stage and give the floor to our first speaker. Welcome, Joe.
Perfect, thank you. This is completely natural and not at all intimidating. So thank you very much for inviting me here. It's an absolutely beautiful place. I've never been here before, so that's lovely. What I'm going to talk about is measuring and explaining the intergenerational earnings persistence of women and men. This is joint with Lindsay McMillan, who some of you I know, and Stuart Campbell, who used to work with her and is now at the Bank of England. So what we're going to talk about here is our kind of, really, it's great that I get to start because I get to say all the really super obvious things that other people won't be able to say. So we know that those from richer backgrounds grow up to earn more, and measuring how much more they earn is a core question in social science. And as Alex nicely introduced, it's something that both economists and sociologists think about quite a lot. And we can think of many advantages associated with having a better family background or a richer family background. We know that people from richer family backgrounds, maybe they have some genetic or ability advantages, things that are just endowed to them. Their parents also make more investments in them. We've seen that in many studies, both in terms of time and in terms of money. And they also have some different opportunities in the labour market. And that's something we're going to talk about a lot today. And both economists and sociologists have tried to pin down those pathways. So I did a little bit of this back in 2007, and then a much more sophisticated version of that has been recently done by Ute Boll, Eric French, and co-authors. But both of these aspects, both the amount of intergenerational persistence and the pathway, have been somewhat understudied for women, although Pear's just given me a couple of new references that I need to look at. So there's two reasons for this, really. One is that the selection into the labour market has often meant that scholars do not estimate earnings persistence for women, or if they do, it's just for a selective sample. So there's an idea that women are a little bit complicated, and so therefore we won't worry about them because there's too many issues we need to take care of. And there's also been very little, there's obviously a rich literature on gender earnings gaps in the labour market, but there hasn't been very much of an idea about how that literature links with the intergenerational literature. Particularly if we think about Claudia Goldin highlighting that half of the gender earnings gap occurs within occupation, we might think that when we look at intergenerational persistence as driven by education and occupation, there may be substantial things that we are missing. So that's a prime motivator for what we're going to do here. And I stole your little picture off the website, and I had a look at these little persons. They don't really look like persons, do they? If you think about what you put on the outside of a toilet door, they look like men. So I thought that was quite noticeable, and maybe a nice little thing to highlight, that perhaps there is a lack of consideration of women when we immediately think about this. And of course, throughout this presentation, we do think about men as well, but it's really women and then men. We're putting the men to the end of the story here. So the research questions that we're going to consider particularly is how does intergenerational earnings mobility differ by sex? How does earnings mobility for women and men change over the life course? What role does differential labour market participation play? So can we look at these things in a slightly different way and get a little bit more of a feel for some of these questions about how selection and how partial labour market engagement might affect mobility measures? Can we account, in some sense, for intergenerational persistence for men and for women by using some of the things that we observe about those groups? And perhaps can we explain things a little bit better by looking a little bit more into the labour market rather than taking just a human capital approach? So they're the things that we're going to be talking about here. It's very simple. It's all super simple. So, you know, it's a nice little warm up for us. So some of the previous literature has been quite, I guess, undecided generally about whether men or women have higher intergenerational persistence. I think there's a bit more of a consensus building recently, but a very early paper in this space for the UK was one that looked at, I'm using a birth cohort study, and this did a Machen and Reed paper from 1997 used an earlier cohort than the one I'm using, and they tended to find that women's persistence is stronger than men's for this earlier cohort. Okay, and then we've got a paper by Raoul et al., who really focused very nicely on the role of assortative mating in this, and they found that this led to lower persistence because women, there was a selection mechanism here by where women married, so maybe women with high potential married men who were also high potential. They actually worked a bit less because of that, and that led to lower earnings persistence in the US and the UK, but not in the Nordic countries. And then there was a couple of new papers by Brandon and I don't know how to say that. Sharp. Okay. Good. And these both address the mobility of women, but my perception there is that they're more interested in the role of the mother and the fact that the mother is working more. But then I was just talking to Per earlier about some of his work and a couple of other new papers that are really demonstrating that over time the fact that women are participating more in the labour market and there's increased equality has led to an overall decline in mobility. Particularly it's been highlighted in Sweden, but somewhat in the US as well. So there's a little bit of thinking about this, and this is the kind of literature that we're trying to make a contribution to. Okay, and the other linked literature that we're talking about is literature on accounting, in a sense, for intergenerational persistence. So a very old paper of mine, it's getting embarrassingly old now, is able to demonstrate that half of the persistence, intergenerational earnings persistence of sons in the data that we use here is driven by the fact that those with higher parental income have higher educational attainment, and that's rewarded in the labour market. Very obvious finding. There's also a twist on that in that we look at two cohorts and show that that's become stronger, and that accounts for some of the increase in intergenerational persistence during that time. Then there's this new paper by Uta Bolt et al., and they build on this framework, but they started off by building on it, and then it became very complicated. So they don't just do linear modelling here, they're really thinking about a CES production function as part of this, but from what I can gather, it doesn't change their results very much doing this CES production function rather than when they started off doing a linear model. So what they do here is they again use this slightly older cohort in the UK, the 1958 cohort, and the advantages of these cohorts is that they have a huge amount of detail on the living circumstances of children as they were growing up. And they adopt in this paper a multi-level mediation approach and find that the main driver of intergenerational elasticity is increased levels of parental investments received by the children of high-income kids. Not rocket science, perhaps, but they're able to, well, it is rocket science, actually, but in terms of the finding, it's quite obvious. And they look into this in a great deal of detail and show that this early investment is then built on by greater cognitive development, better educational outcomes, and then higher lifetime earnings. The first paper, we don't consider daughters at all, we just focus on sons. The second paper does look at daughters, but not in a particularly focused way. Okay? So I think there's a contribution to make as to whether some of these mechanisms are different between men and women, and that's what we try to achieve here. So if we think in terms of the contributions that we're making here, one is that we're able to look across the life cycle between ages 30 and 51. Okay? Previous, especially in the UK, contributions that have looked across the life cycle have really focused on men, and showing that the later you look at people, the later you look at men, the higher their intergenerational persistence is. So that seems to accumulate over the life cycle. It's interesting to see if that's also the case for women. As is quite standard in the literature, we look at differences between elasticity and rank measures and what they can tell us about the patterns of mobility and what they can tell us about how inequality is playing a role here. We also consider the role of participation for earnings mobility by adjusting our measures for hours worked, and also by looking at averages, which enable us to smooth some of these differences in participation for women. And then, as I say, we account as far as possible for differences between men and women in earnings persistence, emphasising the role of the labour market as we do so. Okay, so very straightforwardly, we estimate intergenerational earnings elasticity, it's a very hard word to say, which is the log of earnings in adulthood on the log of parental income. I'll say a bit more about how that's measured in a bit. And we also do the same thing for ranks, so the rank that you're at in the earnings distribution when you're an adult, and the rank of your parental income. Seems to be, oh, I said it seems to still be working, and then I realised it wasn't. So, you know, this idea of the rank correlation has become increasingly common, and as a complement to the elasticity. So they tell us slightly different things. So the first one will be much more influenced by growth in inequality between the generations. The second one will be less influenced by that. The rank is also somewhat less influenced by measurement error, although I think there's a bit more to say about that, and also life cycle bias. And we see that a little bit here, that it's the elasticity that's changing as people get older, and the rank correlation changes rather less. But we might think that we actually do want to pick up some of these influences of inequality, so it's quite a good idea to kind of keep both those measures in hand and see what they tell you. Okay, because intergenerational persistence will be larger if the rungs of the ladder are further apart as people age, and actually that's interesting too. Okay. So this overall intergenerational persistence, which we can measure either as beta, the elasticity, or rho, the rank correlation, can be thought of consisting of three components to start with. So one of these is the extent to which that family income affects individual characteristics, so traditionally education. The second is the returns to those characteristics. And the final one is the direct effect of parental income on children's earnings, leaving constant those characteristics, so that direct part as well. And so we can look at this in terms of just dividing that beta into the part that can be explained and the part that can't be explained. And then we can also take this part that can be explained and divide it into all of these different elements as well. So that gives us quite a rich picture. Something on here. Sorry. I have to get rid of it. Might just have to put up with that. And so we actually do this using the Gelbach decomposition here, but basically it's as straightforward as it looks. There's nothing complicated. And all of this, as I say, is linear. So the data that we use is the British cohort data. So that includes all children born in a single week in 1970s to start with. We do lose a lot along the way. And it contains information on parental income measured at age 10 and age 16. And we average across these two. Now that parental income data is by no means perfect, and it probably does downward bias our estimates, but if we think that our primary interest here is between men and women, we can probably live with that. It's very interesting because in the new Bolt paper, they say, oh, there's a measurement error here. And they just kind of whack everything up by a kind of a massive amount. I don't know if you've seen that. And it's like, okay, fine, we're doing that. But if you're interested in the mechanisms underneath, maybe that's okay. I guess it depends on the relationship between, you know, the selectivity of that measurement error. And we've got information on earnings, work and family status. We don't use that so much in this part of the paper. And ages 30, 34, 38, 42, 46 and 41, which is 51, which has only just become available. Now the nice thing about the cohort data is this information, as I'll show you, is quite rich. Especially there's quite a lot of detail on where you're working, the kind of job you have and your experience of that job. So we're going to make use of that. And also, as you might expect, we have quite rich data on education and also some early measures of ability as well, so at age 10. So we don't really make use of the partners in this part of the paper. So, yeah, so the age 10 ability is measured in two ways. It's measured as kind of cognitive ability, so your performance in scores, we combine that into an index. So reading, mathematics, general intelligence go into there. And then we also have some measures of non-cognitive skills, if you like, or traits, which are based generally on whether you're externalizing or internalizing. So whether you have, in terms of internalizing, you know, do you worry a lot? Are you anxious? Those things. And externalizing is more acting out, you know, being aggressive or stealing or, you know, not doing as you're told. So we pick those things up at about age 10. And in the past, they've been shown to be quite predictive. So here's some information on women here. I need to adjust the employment stuff a little bit because it's a bit too high, because I think that's based on a selected sample. But it does show you, you know, that you do get some partial participation in the 30s, which then rises up to women of 30, up to when women are 46. Oh, sorry, I didn't realise I didn't have the age 51 stuff on here. You also see the same with hours, where you see those. Actually, you don't, do you? So you see those decline a little bit because more women are coming into the labour market but working part-time as they get older. You see that around 40 to 50% of women are working in professional and managerial occupations, and that gets somewhat larger as they move, as they get a little bit older. What else is interesting here? The other one that's interesting is the share of women working in the public sector, which is about half of them by the time they're in their 40s. And you can also see for age 42 and 46, we can measure these things about job stress, job autonomy, and whether your job is interesting. And I'll show you when we make use of those, I'll show you the exact questions. We're getting too far from the mic, I think. I'll show you the exact questions that are used in those. But what you generally find is that women tend to have slightly less autonomy in their jobs. And they flip in terms of whether they're more stressed or less stressed than men. So they start off less stressed and they become more stressed as they get to age 46. I'll show you the same sort of figures for the men. So you can see here that a lot fewer men work in the public sector. They tend to be more likely to be managers. They have higher earnings. And if you look here at the job autonomy, they have more job autonomy. They have slightly more interesting jobs by the end of by the age of they're 46. We don't have these job autonomy and job interest scores for age 51, so we do actually focus, we'll see at the end of the presentations, at age 42 and 46, although we use the 51 for some stuff as well. Okay. So standard approaches in the literature really focus very much on earnings mobility, and they don't really think very much about wage mobility. So we're going to do a little bit of that. So if we think that what we're often interested in is kind of the intergenerational correlation of productivity, in a sense, if that's a measure of human capital, we might be interested in measuring hourly wages, which is not something that people do very much. So it's interesting to think about whether there's a difference between measuring, especially for women, earnings mobility and hourly wage mobility. And that's really going to depend on some of these mechanisms I mentioned above, whether it's women who are married to rich men work less, if we think there's assortative mating, or whether women who are married to rich men are also productive and they select into the labour market. And I think, Francis, actually, I was looking at your stuff yesterday, there was a bit of commentary on one of your papers about women selecting in positively or negatively into the labour market. So this is something that we can have a look at here. So, first results then. This is the intergenerational elasticity for women on one side and for men on the other side. And the first thing that you can see is that there's a clear trend upward for men. And this is something that people have been thinking about in terms of calling it life cycle bias. So as men become more settled in the labour market, they receive the full returns on their education. People from richer backgrounds have more education. You tend to see this rising. For women, the pattern is less clear. You get this kind of bump up at age 34, and then you don't really see very much of that at all. We can also estimate these based on average earnings. So for women, it's 0.4, and for men, it's a secret. A bit higher, I think. I can't see that, but I'm sure it's about 0.5. Kind of makes it obvious. I don't know how I can move that. Can I pick it up?
You have to exit the presentation, close it.
Yeah, I'm not going to do that. That seems to be making life far too difficult. Oh, now what's happening? Oh, okay, I did that absolutely on purpose. Oh, look, it's 0.47. So what happens when we adjust this for labour supply at a point in time is it seems to have much more of an effect on women, which is kind of what we would probably expect if we think that there's more of a selection into working different hours for women compared to men. So what we see for age 30 and 34, so these prime kind of childbearing years, especially for women who maybe had their children a little bit younger, we can observe that when you look at wages, you get a drop in the persistence. So what this is implying is that women who have more productivity, human capital, are working more at these young ages, and so their earnings are higher, and also they have come from richer family backgrounds, so there's kind of positive selection into work, and when you take that out, you actually reduce these estimates a little bit, but that's weaker as they move into older ages. Because, you know, women, as they've got older children, they tend to come back into work, and that selection is not quite so clear. And as I say, for men, they basically track each other with a little bit of evidence of selection here as well. Oh, I feel like I've missed one. Okay. And then when we look, I think I've missed no, maybe not, that's fine. And then when we look at rank mobility, we can do that both for weekly and hourly earnings. And what we see here is that everything's quite a lot flatter. There's less going on. So this implies that some of the intergenerational mobility intergenerational persistence that we were observing is coming about because there's higher inequality in the second generation. Although we'd kind of expect that because we think that probably the income and earnings measures are probably slightly better in the second generation, so you would expect to see more variation. And what you can also observe here, though, is that it's clearly the case that there is more persistence for men by rank. You can see that's also true in the earlier years, in the later years for men by elasticity as well. So what we want to do then is explain a couple of things about this. We want to explain why you see these changes over time for men, and we want to explain why these levels seem to be somewhat different as well. So So when we do that, we can then bring in these additional characteristics, this information we have on skills, on human capital, on educational outcome, and on labour markets, variables. And the way that we do that is, first of all, we begin by looking at skills and attributes at age 10. So these measures of cognitive skills and non-cognitive skills. We look at education as measured by the number of GCSEs, so that's at age 16, number of A-levels at age 18, and then degree. We did actually have more detailed information here about the institution and degree subject, but we find that didn't really add anything, actually, so I won't really show you, because once the other qualifications are in there, strangely, it didn't really do anything, which we were a bit surprised about. You can also consider investments as a pathway, or look in more detail at the kind of build it up. So you're looking at investments that build skills, that then builds education, all the pathways within that. But actually, we found that one there, it doesn't really seem to add very much in the way that they do that. And in terms of our interest in the difference between genders, it didn't really make much sense, because as I'll show you when we get to the results, it all seems to be happening at the education level and then beyond that. So these are kind of some graphs which show you what's happening here. So our first graph here is showing the extent to which mobility is being mediated through skills and education. I'm combining them here, but you can also show them separately, obviously. And what you can see here is that the difference between men and women is quite small. Okay? So it looks like, in terms of elasticity, that apart from at age 51, there's not that much difference. And any differences there are not particularly consistent. So this means that to the extent that intergenerational persistence is occurring because people have better skills and they go off and do better in the labour market, that seems to be the same kind of story between men and women. But the second graph is a bit more interesting, because what this is showing is that for men, there's an additional aspect of this, which is over and above what women get, which comes from the fact that even for men with the same educational level, those from richer backgrounds do better in the labour market. Okay, so that makes us think, well, could we begin to kind of unpick this labour market aspect? So there's an unexplained channel that's got beyond education and skills there. And for ranks, you see something that's altogether a bit more muted, but basically the same between men and women. And then especially in the middle years of our data, for the ranks, you see that again there's this difference in that unexplained component between men and women. Okay? So that makes us wonder whether we can say something about that. Okay, so we've looked so far at skills, we've looked at education, but we also have information, because we've got these rich cohort data, on job characteristics. Okay, so for all waves, we have sector, we have number of workers in the organisation, we have whether you commute for more than 1 hour, whether you're a manager or supervisor, whether you do overtime, and detailed occupation. And we think that many of these variables are quite interesting, because if you think of Claudia Goldin's story about why there's still quite a lot of inequality between men and women in the labour market, some of these variables speak exactly to that. So there's a recent nice study by colleagues at the IFS who've shown that there's a commuting gap, so that when women have children, they're much less likely to commute than men with children. There's this idea that even when men and women are in the same occupation, you end up, women will take the kind of, slightly less demanding role there. Maybe if both of them are lawyers, maybe the woman will be a local lawyer in the local town, and the man will be commuting into London. Okay? Those kind of stories are the ones that we can begin to capture by some of these variables. And as I've already mentioned, we've also got these nice variables at age 42 and 46, which tell us about specific job attributes, which again might be correlated with some of those stories. So we've got stress, so my job requires that I work very fast, I work under a great deal of tension, my job often involves working to tight deadlines. Interest, I'm learning through my work. And autonomy, my job allows me to take part in decisions that affect my work. I am closely supervising my work, which is reverse coded, and I can decide my start and finish times. So as academics, of course, we're all hanging around here with all of this lovely autonomy, or we think we are anyway. So these variables we think might add a nice nuance to the story, and they're not the kind of thing that you could get at through administrative data sets. Now I'll have to go back because I didn't close the loop. There we go. We've also got full work history. So although we're only observing these earnings and job variables at the point in time the surveys were taken, which is just like, you know, what was your last paycheck, what is your job like now, you can actually fill in the gaps because they were asked to record every job that they've had and whether it was full-time or part-time. So we make use of that as well. Another nice feature of this, because you'll see we don't quite explain everything, so we're like, oh, what else could we find? So one of the things that we've added quite recently is you are asked, how much of your family, have your family and friends helped you to get a job? How much did they, how important was this help? So we would think that this would be a very nice way of getting at the intergenerational transmissions into the labour market as well. So we have a look at that too. Okay, so not all of these variables are available for every wave. Okay, so what I'm showing you here for every wave is information on basic job characteristics. So this doesn't include the stressed stuff. This doesn't include, did your parents help you get a job? This is just basic stuff about sector, commuting, those kind of things. And what you can see here is that there's a little bit of evidence that these things are, the explained part becomes slightly higher for men here than for women, but obviously it's not statistically significant. And we still see a bit of a gap with the direct part, the part that's not explained, even when we've controlled for all of this, that it's a bit higher for men than it is for women. But I think that gap is reduced slightly if you squint, but we'll see it in a little bit more detail in a second. And the same story with the ranks. You see a little bit more going on in skills, education and jobs, and a little bit less happening in the direct component. Okay, but this actually shows us these things a little bit more nicely. So, as I mentioned, for age 42 and age 46, you have these extra variables. So you have this information on the job attributes, as I call it, and you have this information on parental help. So this shows how those gaps close between men and women as we add more stuff. So I'll take you through this kind of fairly slowly. So our baseline is what we started with. Okay, so we can see that this is higher for men, the diamond, than it is for women in the circle. And the square tells us the gap between them. And obviously that gives us a really nice way of looking at whether that gap is statistically significant. When we control for education, both of those, the men and the women, come down. The gap doesn't change very much if we compare the squares. Okay? Job characteristics, we get a little bit lower, okay? But it's still significantly different. Job attributes, basically a tiny bit lower. Parental help isn't changing the gap very much either. And then when we add employment histories, that kind of, there's not a huge amount going on. So basically when adding the basic job characteristics does bring this gap down a bit. Adding the extra stuff brings it down a tiny bit. I think we were hoping it would do a little bit more. And it's the same kind of story for age 46 as well. So you can see you've got this big gap, which comes down, and then comes down a little bit more, and then kind of bumps around a little bit, more or less insignificant by the end of the story. And then for ranks, so the wrong way around, you see that you basically can close the gap when you've added a bunch of stuff, okay, for one of these ages, but not for the others. But that's not really so surprising because the gap was a bit smaller in the first place. Okay? Yeah?
Maybe a clarification question. The job attributes, are those the work pressure?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So there's those extra variables there. Okay. And then we can actually do this in a slightly different way. Rather than just adding a bunch of stuff, because we know that sometimes the order in which we add those things makes a difference, we can actually show visually the different elements of this. So we've got the elasticity for women at 42 and men at 42. You can see it's larger for men, as you would expect, and that red direct component is greater. So it's not the case that we can kind of explain that away and make those two red bits about the same size with all this extra stuff. But you can see that some of the other elements are slightly larger as well. These job characteristics are larger. The education component is larger. Very similar results at age 46 as well. And for the ranks, again, everything's a little bit more muted, but you can still see that there are some things that are have a bit more explanatory power for the men, but still some unexplained differences as well. We were hoping we could make that red a little bit smaller, but it hasn't quite happened yet. So adjusting for hours worked reduces observed persistence strongly for women, particularly early in the 30s, and particularly for the elasticity measure. We saw this rise in terms of the elasticity for men, which is quite a familiar result. We don't see such a large rise for women, and we don't see such a large rise when we look at the rank mobilities. Generally, the differences between genders are a bit smaller for ranks compared to elasticities. That's actually quite interesting as well, I think, because you're picking up some of that difference in inequality that's risen for women between one generation and the next. And that doesn't seem to be quite so pronounced when you look at the ranks. That was a very confused statement, but anyway, we can come back to that if you want. And despite differences over the life cycle in elasticity by gender, the contribution of education and skills is similar, so that's kind of an important result which maybe I haven't stressed enough. That actually, if you were just looking at education, you would see the persistence for men and women is very similar. It's what happens beyond education that's giving men this kind of extra bump. And we can somewhat account for significant differences, so we can make it insignificant, but there is still a little bit more that we would like to explain. I think there's just one thing that I want to say about this. And I think the most important thing is we're probably going to get access to some administrative data to do the earnings here, which means that we can get much nicer information on earnings history. So I think that's where we're going to go with this project next. And that's actually a nice feature of these cohorts, is that they're going to be matching them with tax data. So you'll have all this richness about characteristics which wouldn't be available in your standard administrative data, but hopefully with very high quality earnings to complement that as well. So I think having spent a bit of time thinking about this project yesterday, I think that's the way that we're going to go with it. So I think that's around about the right time. So thank you.
Thank you. Super interesting presentation and fascinating findings also. I was wondering, you look at parents as one combination, and you don't look at gender differences among parents, and I could imagine that if you want to explain the gender gap, so maybe also the intergenerational persistence in that, you might benefit a bit from looking at mothers as well.
Yeah, unfortunately we can't do it because they only ask about parental income. Yeah, but you're dead right. So we concentrate on the second generation.
Thank you. Does this? I'm interested in job characteristics, actually, and occupational characteristic in my own work. And so I guess here I'm just struggling to understand what are the mechanisms that you're thinking through when you're linking this kind of family income at age 14, 16. Like, I understand the education, how that kind of, but I don't understand, the selection into those specific job characteristics. Like, what's the story kind of that, that allows to see, and also with this life course component, why would it matter more at 46 and less at 32, or so kind of more in the story type and the pathways.
Can I answer that one? Yeah. So I think the idea here is that the most successful jobs are these ones, and I guess this is really sort of, it is focusing a little bit on the top end. So the most successful jobs are the ones where you have long commutes, you have supervisory responsibility, you have all of these aspects, and that is a way that men who are from richer backgrounds end up in the best jobs and end up earning the most money. And that's what we can see here, because it seems that they do play a role. They don't seem to play a role in intergenerational persistence for women, and that's because generally, or our story is that generally there's less variation in those things for women anyway, because they do, even if they're very well educated, they may or on average they may step back more from the labour market. So that's the mechanism.
Thanks for the presentation. Very interesting findings. Thinking about women and men in their mid-40s, I feel like, well, based on my own observation, if a person gets divorced, for women, they are more likely to just stay, are single and with kids. So the household income is more likely to come from just a one income earner. Whereas for men, so they are more likely to be partnered or get married again. So the household income calculations are more likely to come from two income earners. So I wonder if there is a way for you to control for that.
So everything here is individual earnings, but when we started this project, we had two papers. So one was on this earnings story and the human capital story and the labour market story, and the other one was how partnering affects these things. Now, it's a little bit limited what we can do, because we don't observe that much information on the partner. And although it kind of makes it more interesting, you've also got this issue of the partner changing. So you can't necessarily say, oh, well, it's the same person. But I think what you say is really interesting, actually, and it makes me want to go back and think again about that other project and wonder whether we should do more with that. But it's kind of sitting on the side at the moment. We didn't look at divorce, actually. That was one thing we didn't look at. We were very like Cinderella about it. That's probably not very realistic. So we should do that. Somebody behind you wants the oh, wow. Where did that come from? Super efficient.
Sorry. Thank you for a presentation. I also find it very interesting. I was just wondering if we compare this woman and men in the mid-30s, mid-40s, does having a children actually matters? Because when I'm thinking about the story that the man and woman in the same job positions, and we talk about the penalty of from having a childbirth. So, but I didn't really see the stories involved in this presentation. So I was wondering, what do you think about this? As they have as a parent themselves, does it matter?
Yeah, I think it's definitely bound up with that. I think that's almost, so I tried to pull it out separately, but I think it's so correlated you almost can't. That's what's driving the story. And if you try to separate those with children and without children, you just end up with a really small sample of people without children in this data. That may be partly a bit of a selection effect, so you do lose quite a lot of people as these guys get older, and I wonder whether you keep in more who've got children just because perhaps they're more, they're less mobile and so on. But that's definitely, I think, what's going on. But I haven't been successful in actually showing it, although I did have a little fiddle with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question that follows up on G a little bit. So I was thinking about what are the policy conclusions, and from that I was thinking, wouldn't it be more relevant to ask who is at a larger risk of falling down, man or woman? because that clearly goes back to this question about divorce and speaks more closely probably to policy conclusions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, all of these things are, you know, you get the classic issue, the kind of absolute versus relative, you know, story here. But yeah, even within the relative component, you could look at who's falling down. Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you.
Very nice opening.